Imagine that today you have lost everything. You have no home, no money, and the London fog outside is thick with coal smoke and sewage. You have a choice: die of hunger in a gutter, or voluntarily enter a prison they call a workhouse. Here they will separate you from your wife and children the very minute you arrive. They will hand you a uniform made of coarse burlap and force you to crush stones or unpick old, tarred ropes for 10 hours a day until your fingers bleed. Your meal is a watery porridge called gruel and a piece of stale bread. This is not a punishment for a crime. This is the only help the world's greatest empire offers its poor. Why, in an age of unprecedented progress and golden palaces, did millions live in conditions that a modern prisoner would consider torture? How did a system designed to help turn into a machine for destroying human dignity? Today, you will walk the path of a person who made one single mistake: being poor in 1834. And believe me, once you see how they valued your life, you will look at your breakfast today very differently. In 1834, the British government passed the Poor Law Amendment Act. In modern terms, this was like a software update for society, but instead of fixing bugs, it decided to delete the users it found unproductive. The logic was simple and brutal. If you are poor, it is your fault. Poverty was treated not as a social tragedy, but as a moral infection. To cure it, they created the workhouse. When you cross the threshold of this building, you are not just checking into a shelter. You are undergoing a legal lobotomy. Your clothes, your last link to your past life, are taken away and sent to the furnace or storage. You are washed in the same water as a dozen other people. It is a humiliating ritual of cleansing that feels more like preparing livestock for market than helping a human being. The Victorian authorities didn't want you to feel comfortable. They had a doctrine for this, called less eligibility. Imagine a customer service department designed specifically to make you want to hang up the phone. The goal was to make life inside the workhouse so repulsive, so physically and mentally soul-crushing, that you would rather work for pennies in a coal mine than stay here. Once the heavy wooden door shuts behind you, the first thing you notice is the silence. In this house, it is forbidden to speak during meals or work. You are surrounded by hundreds of people, yet you are effectively in solitary confinement. They have taken your family, your clothes, and now they have taken your voice. Your new identity is a burlap uniform that scratches your skin until it turns red and raw. In the 19th century, this was the ultimate brand of shame. If you walk down a London street in this outfit today, people might think it is a high-fashion, homeless chic statement from a runway in Milan. But in 1834, it was a target on your back that told the world you were a surplus person. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of the deserving and undeserving poor. If you were old or sick, they might give you a slightly softer bed. But if you were an able-bodied man, the system treated you like a criminal who hadn't been caught yet. You were expected to pay for your watery porridge with the only thing you had left: your physical labor and your health. But the real horror begins at 6 in the morning, when the bell rings and you are marched to the workrooms. You think your 9-to-5 job is draining? Try a 14-hour shift where the only bonus is not being whipped or starved even further. Your workday begins at 6 in the morning, and the first task on the menu is a charming activity called picking oakum. Imagine you are an intern at a tech startup, but instead of coding, your job is to manually recycle old, tarred navy ropes. You take these heavy, stiff cables and pull them apart into raw fibers using nothing but your bare fingers. The tar is thick and black, staining your skin and baking under your fingernails. By noon, your fingertips are worn down to the sensitive flesh, and every pull feels like a small electric shock of pain. Why did they make you do this? Because the Royal Navy needed this fluff to plug the gaps in the hulls of their warships. The British Empire was literally held together by the bleeding fingers of its most desperate citizens. If you were too slow, the overseer would simply cut your already pathetic rations. It is the ultimate performance-based pay structure, where the penalty for underperforming is literal starvation. But perhaps you are lucky and get assigned to stone breaking instead. You are given a heavy iron hammer and a pile of large rocks. Your goal is to turn them into gravel for London's roads. It is repetitive, bone-shaking labor that destroys your joints and fills your lungs with fine stone dust. In 1888, They didn't have health and safety regulations or noise-canceling headphones. You just hammered until the pile was gone or you collapsed. Think of it as a CrossFit session that lasts 14 hours, but instead of a protein shake, you get a lecture on the virtues of hard work. Now, let's talk about the culinary experience in the workhouse. If the labor was meant to break your body, the food was meant to break your spirit. The staple of your diet is gruel, a mixture of oatmeal and water so thin you could read a newspaper through it if you were allowed to have one. To the Victorian administrators, giving you actual nutrition was seen as coddling the poor. In some workhouses, the hunger reached such a peak of desperation that it led to the infamous Andover Bone Scandal. Imagine being so hungry that you begin to eye the piles of rotten, sun-bleached bones you are supposed to be crushing into fertilizer. Historical records show that starving inmates fought over these bones, gnawing on the putrid gristle and marrow just to feel something in their stomachs. It is a level of horror that even modern disaster movies struggle to capture. The administrators defended this by saying it saved the taxpayers money. They were the original budget hawks, calculating that the life of a poor man was worth less than the cost of a decent potato. They even weighed the food to the gram. A typical dinner might be 5 ounces of bread and a pint of broth that had never seen a piece of meat. If you were caught stealing an extra crust of bread, you could be sent to an actual prison, which, ironically, often had better food than the workhouse. Compare this to our modern world. We have lifestyle coaches telling us to fast for 20 hours to cleanse our systems. In 1834, the government called that intermittent fasting a mandatory state policy for the lower classes. The difference is, you can choose to end your fast with a $20 avocado toast. The Victorian worker ended his fast with more work and a prayer for a quick death. The most psychological part of this torture was the separation of spheres. If you entered the workhouse with your wife, you were immediately moved to different wings of the building. The Victorians believed that if poor people were allowed to stay together, they would simply produce more poor children, creating a cycle of poverty that the taxpayer would have to fund. You could live under the same roof as your spouse for years and never speak a word to them. You would hear your children crying in the distance, but the iron rules of the house forbade you from going to comfort them. If the hunger didn't break your mind, the silence certainly would. In the Victorian workhouse, communication was treated like a luxury item that you simply couldn't afford. Imagine living in a high-density apartment complex where the landlord installs sensors that fine you every time you speak to a neighbor. During meals, during work, and especially during the long, dark hours in the wards, silence was the iron law. The authorities believed that if the poor were allowed to talk, they would only conspire to be lazier or, heaven forbid, share stories of their shared misery. To the Victorian mind, a quiet worker was a compliant worker. You could sit across from a man for 5 years, watching the same gray soup stain his beard every day, and never know his name. It was social media in reverse. Instead of an endless feed of information, you were trapped in a permanent mute setting. And then there is the open door policy, perhaps the most cynical piece of psychological warfare ever devised by a government. Technically, you were not a prisoner. You were a voluntary inmate. You could leave at any time. All you had to do was give 3 hours' notice to the master. But here is the catch that the fine print didn't emphasize. You had to leave with exactly what you brought in. Since your original clothes had likely been sold or had rotted away in storage, and you couldn't take the workhouse uniform because that was considered theft of parish property, you faced a terrifying reality. Leaving the workhouse often meant walking out into the freezing London streets in nothing but your skin. It was the original Hotel California. You could check out any time you liked, but you could never actually leave without a death sentence from the elements. The system was designed to create a state of learned helplessness. By taking away your clothes, your family, your hair, which was shorn off upon entry, and your name, they reduced you to a biological unit. You became a pauper, a legal status that stripped you of the right to vote or have any say in how the country was run. In 1834, being poor wasn't just a financial state, it was a civil death. Compare this to the modern gig economy. We are told we have the freedom to work whenever we want, but if we don't log in, the algorithm starves us of opportunities. The Victorian version was just more honest about the cruelty. They didn't use an algorithm, They used a stone wall and a heavy iron gate. They called it charity, but it was actually a debt collection agency for the crime of existing without a bank account. For the children in the workhouse, the education was even more calculated. They weren't taught to think, they were taught to obey. They were trained for the very same life of drudgery their parents were currently enduring in the next wing over. A boy would be taught the basics of cobbling or stone breaking, while a girl was trained to be a domestic servant, the lowest rung on the ladder of Victorian respectability. The goal was to ensure that the next generation of surplus people was just as quiet and just as broken as the last. The only entertainment allowed was the reading of the Bible, usually by an overseer who skipped the parts about the eye of a needle and focused heavily on the parts about servants, obey your masters. It was a world devoid of color, music, or warmth. The walls were whitewashed, the floors were bare stone, and the sky was a permanent shade of soot gray. You were living in a black and white movie where the only plot point was your eventual expiration. While you were starving on 5 ounces of bread, the people in charge, the guardians and the masters, were often living a very different Victorian reality. The workhouse was a business, and like any business with zero transparency, it was a breeding ground for mid-level tyrants. The master of the workhouse was essentially the CEO of a concentration camp for the poor, and his main KPI was cost reduction. If he could find a way to feed you even thinner gruel and pocket the difference, he would. There was a dark irony in the fact that the men preaching moral discipline to you were often the most corrupt figures in the parish. Historical audits from the 1880s revealed masters who sold off the workhouse's meat supply to local butchers while serving the inmates broth that was nothing more than salty water and despair. They lived in comfortable apartments within the same stone walls where you slept on straw, sipping fine port while you choked on dust. It is the ultimate corporate hierarchy. Those at the top feast on the efficiency gained by starving those at the bottom. Inside this system, a shadow economy emerged. Even in a world of silence and burlap, humans find a way to trade. The currency wasn't money, it was a crust of bread, a scrap of tobacco smuggled in by a sympathetic carter, or a slightly better pair of boots taken from a man who died during the night. If you were strong enough to work the stone yard, you might trade your physical protection for a portion of a weaker inmate's dinner. It was a brutal, micro-level version of the capitalism that had rejected you on the outside. Even in the depths of poverty, the hustle culture didn't die, it just became a matter of life and death. But the most macabre part of the Victorian workhouse machine was what happened when you finally retired from the struggle, when you died. In modern America, we have the death industry, with its expensive caskets and memorial services. In 1888 London, if you died in the workhouse, you were simply a final line item to be cleared from the ledger. According to the Anatomy Act of 1832, if your family couldn't pay for your funeral within 48 hours, which they obviously couldn't because they were likely in the wing next to yours, your body became the property of the state. You were packed into a plain wooden crate and sold to medical schools for dissection. The very surgeons who would go on to save the lives of the wealthy learned their trade by carving up the surplus people who had been worked to death by the system. Imagine the indignity. After a life of being told your body belonged to the parish, you discover that even your corpse is a commodity. You were literally worth more to the British Empire as an anatomical specimen than you were as a living human being. They would map your muscles, study your malnourished organs, and then dump what was left into a mass grave. No headstone, no name, just a number in a dusty book. This wasn't just a byproduct of the system, it was the final deterrent. The fear of being cut up by the surgeons was often greater than the fear of starvation. It was the ultimate psychological cage. The Victorian government didn't just want to control your labor, they wanted to own the very idea of your existence, from the first thread of your burlap uniform to the last bone on the dissecting table. When we look at our world today, we see the echoes. We see the way human resources departments talk about optimizing people, and we see the way poverty is still treated as a personal failure rather than a systemic trap. The Victorian workhouse may be gone, but the iron logic behind it, that a person without money is a person without rights, is a ghost that still haunts our modern economy. By the 1890s, the stone walls of the workhouse were beginning to crack, not from age, but from the mounting pressure of a world that was finally growing a conscience. The British public, long fed on a diet of poverty as a moral choice, was starting to see the footage, so to speak, of what was actually happening inside. Social reformers like Charles Booth and Seabaum Roundtree began mapping poverty with the precision of a military campaign. They proved that you weren't in the workhouse because you were lazy. You were there because the economy was a meat grinder and you were the meat. The original software of 1834 was failing. New unions and socialist movements began to argue that a citizen had a right to exist regardless of their bank balance. They looked at the 300,000 horses in London producing 1,000 tons of waste every single day and realized that the government was spending more effort managing animal manure than human lives. The surplus people were finally finding their voice, and for the first time in 60 years, the silence of the workhouse was broken by the sound of protest. The system didn't die overnight, it evolved. The workhouses were renamed Poor Law Institutions in 1913, but a new name doesn't change the smell of carbolic acid and despair. It took the trauma of the First World War to finally dismantle the machine. When the sons of the wealthy and the sons of the paupers died in the same muddy trenches, it became impossible to argue that one was morally superior to the other. The less eligibility doctrine looked pathetic in the face of a generation wiped out by machine guns. So what is the legacy of the 1888 London season and its dark mirror, the workhouse? Today we don't have stone walls and burlap uniforms for the poor, but we have algorithms that decide your credit score. We don't have deportment masters making 17-year-old girls walk with steel rods in their spines, but we have a hustle culture that demands 24/7 availability for the sake of a corporate presentation. The Victorian Workhouse was the first attempt to industrialize human misery. It was a factory where the raw material was your dignity and the finished product was a slightly more efficient tax ledger. The Victorians built this machine and called it society, and they dressed it in silk and candlelight to make it look like a romance novel. But beneath the 3 ostrich feathers of the debutante and the gold lace of the master was a cold, hard truth. In a world where everything is for sale, a person who has nothing to sell is a person who has no right to be. We look back at 1888 and think of it as a distant, primitive time. We pity the girl in the 6-foot silk train managing her walk backwards in front of a queen. We pity the man picking oakum until his fingers bleed for a bowl of watery gruel. But perhaps we should look at our own seasons, our own rituals of performance, our own voluntary contracts that we cannot leave, and our own silence in the face of systemic cruelty. The carriage is outside. The gates are open, but the world hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. The only difference is that now, the corset is digital, and the workhouse has no walls. It's everywhere.